a little girl rushed into a police station and cried out loud, "Please arrest my daddy." At first, the officers froze in disbelief. Why would a child beg for something like that? But when the truth finally came out, it left the entire station in tears. Stay with us, because this story will break your heart and open your eyes. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Riverside Heights Police Department was unusually still that summer morning. The old ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, pushing the heavy air in slow, tired circles. Officers leaned back in their chairs, sipping burnt coffee, their eyes drifting across stacks of unfinished reports. It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed urgent, the kind of lull that made even the most seasoned cops drop their guard. That stillness shattered in an instant when the station doors slammed open. A small black girl stumbled inside, her braids fraying, her dress clinging to skin damp with sweat. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, yet her chest heaved as if she had run across the entire town. Her wide eyes, bright with tears, darted desperately from one officer to the next as though searching for someone who could save her. For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the fans and the shuffle of papers were the only sounds left in the room. Then, her voice cracked through the silence like a bolt of lightning. "Please, arrest my daddy." The words hung in the air, so raw and piercing that every officer froze where they sat. Mugs clattered onto desks. Pens stilled mid-sentence. The quiet of the room was replaced by something heavier, an unease that settled like a weight across every chest. Sergeant Marcus Reed, a man who had spent decades on the force and prided himself on being unshakable, leaned forward, his weathered face tightening. He had seen drunks, thieves, and desperate liars, but never had he heard a child plead for her father to be taken away in handcuffs. The strangeness of it made his jaw set hard. Across the room, Officer Naomi Cole, the youngest on the team but known for her quick instincts, rose from her chair without hesitation. She walked toward the girl, her voice gentle but urgent, the way someone speaks to a skittish bird. "Sweetheart," Naomi said softly, crouching until she was eye level. "What's your name?" The girl clung to the front desk as though letting go meant she might collapse. Her small fingers gripped the wood, and her lips trembled before she managed to answer. "Clara." Naomi offered her a reassuring nod. "Clara, you're safe here, but you have to help me understand. Why do you want us to arrest your daddy?" Clara's lip quivered, her breath catching in tiny hiccups. She swallowed, her throat working hard to form the words, and when they finally came, they were nothing more than a whisper, but one that drained the air from the entire room. "He can't stay free. Please take him to jail." The station fell silent again, but this time the silence was colder, heavier. Every officer felt the weight of those words pressing against their ribs. And instinctively they knew no child said something like that without reason. The moment Clara's plea left her lips, Sergeant Marcus Reed's expression hardened. A child might exaggerate, but they never invent terror without reason. He gave a sharp nod, and the station snapped into motion. Clara was guided gently to a chair near the front desk, where a kind-eyed officer brought her a cup of water. She sat trembling, her small hands wrapped around the cup though she didn't drink. Naomi Cole stayed close, crouched beside her, offering quiet words of comfort. Meanwhile, Reed and 2 officers moved quickly, climbing into a patrol car and heading for the Morales residence. Naomi wanted to stay behind with Clara, and Reed agreed. It was better to keep her in safe hands than risk exposing her to whatever waited at home. The drive was short, but the silence inside the squad car was thick. When they pulled up, the sight of the house spoke louder than any words Clara had offered. The place sagged under years of neglect. Paint peeled in strips from the siding, weeds consumed the yard, and torn sheets hung where curtains should have been. It didn't look like a home. It looked like survival. Reed approached the porch and knocked hard on the warped door. "Police, open up." His fist echoed through the house, but no footsteps followed. He struck again, sharper. "We know someone's inside. Open the door." Still nothing. He stepped back, jaw set. "Take it down." A single kick splintered the doorframe, and the door swung open to a stale rush of air. Inside, the living room was bare and colorless. A broken couch leaned against the wall. A table stood on crooked legs, and in the corner sat an unplugged television coated with dust. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of Reed's boots on the floorboards. Then they saw him. Slumped on a stained mattress in the corner was a man. He was gaunt, his skin pulled tight against bone, his dark face lined with exhaustion. His arms rested limply at his sides, and when his eyes flickered toward them, there was no fight, no anger, only confusion and weariness. This was David Morales, Clara's father. "Stand up, hands where we can see them," Reed commanded, his tone flat. David shifted, pressing his palms against the mattress to lift himself. His knees buckled almost immediately, his thin body swaying as though even gravity was too much. Reed moved forward, caught his wrist, and pulled him upright just long enough to snap cold steel around his wrists. David's breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. His cracked voice stumbled out, weak but panicked. "Please, what's happening?" Reed didn't slow. "We'll talk at the station." But David's voice rose again, this time not for himself but for something far more fragile. "Wait, please. I have a kid at home." His words cracked under the weight of desperation. Reed's answer came firmly, clipped. "Your kid's safe." David froze. His hollow eyes widened, filling with terror. His entire body stiffened against the cuffs, as though those words, "your kid's safe," struck deeper than the arrest itself. His voice came out as a broken whisper. "Don't take me away from her." Reed pushed him toward the door, but inside, Naomi's instincts echoed in his head. Something was wrong. This wasn't the panic of a guilty man. It was the fear of a father who had already lost too much. Back at Riverside Heights Police Department, Clara sat curled in the hard plastic chair where Naomi had left her. The untouched cup of water rested on the desk beside her, its surface trembling slightly each time the front doors opened and closed. She kept glancing toward those doors as though waiting for something she couldn't name. Naomi stayed close, crouched beside her, offering quiet reassurances, but the girl's eyes remained fixed on that entryway. Minutes later, the heavy doors creaked open again. Officers stepped inside with David Morales in their grip. His wrists were bound in steel, his head bowed, his thin frame swaying under the weight of his own exhaustion. To most of the room, he looked like a suspect. To Clara, he was everything. The moment she saw him, her small voice broke into a scream that rattled the walls. "Daddy!" Before anyone could react, she shot from her chair, her shoes pounding across the floor. She collided with her father's frail frame so hard he stumbled to his knees. The handcuffs cut into his wrists as he tried to return her embrace, but it didn't matter. His face collapsed against her shoulder, and tears slid into her braids. The station went still. Officers froze mid-sentence, their reports forgotten. The air was thick with a silence no one dared break. Even Sergeant Reed, who had seen hardened men beg and cry in handcuffs, felt his composure falter at the sight of a 6-year-old clinging to her father as though letting go would mean losing him forever. Clara's sobs shook her small frame. "Daddy, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Naomi felt her throat tighten. She knelt beside them, her eyes moving from Clara's little hands gripping her father's shirt to the tears that ran unchecked down David's face. Gently, she asked, "Clara, sweetheart, do you remember why you wanted us to take him?" Clara sniffled, pulled her sleeve across her nose, and looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Her voice cracked as she whispered the words that shattered the room. "I just wanted him to eat." The silence deepened. A murmur rippled among the officers, disbelief and unease spreading like a current. Naomi leaned closer, her voice low but steady. "What do you mean, Clara?" The child hiccuped, her words tumbling out in fragments but sharp enough to cut through every heart in the room. "On TV, they said people in jail get food 3 times a day. Daddy never eats. He gives me everything. Last night, I saw him crying at the fridge. There was nothing inside." Her confession fell like a hammer. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was standing in front of them, spoken through the broken voice of a child who carried burdens far too heavy for her age. Naomi's breath caught. Reed's jaw tightened. Officers who had been ready to judge now shifted uncomfortably, their silence betraying their shame. And in the middle of the room, David Morales knelt, cuffed and shaking, his daughter in his arms, the truth spilling into the open at last. The weight of Clara's words pressed down on the station like a storm cloud, and for a long moment, no one moved. Officers who had been flipping through reports now stared at the floor, unable to meet each other's eyes. Even Sergeant Reed, who prided himself on staying detached, found his jaw tight, and his chest heavy with something he did not want to admit was sorrow. Naomi Cole stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady as she addressed David Morales. He was still on his knees, his frail body sagging beneath the handcuffs, with Clara clinging desperately to his chest. "She says you don't eat," Naomi said carefully, her eyes locked on his. "Is that true?" David lowered his gaze, his voice emerging in a low rasp that carried both shame and defiance. "She comes first. Always." Clara's little hands tightened around his shirt, as though to prove his words true, her grip fierce in its innocence. Reed exhaled slowly, his tone turning firm as he asked the question hanging unspoken in the air. "And what about her mother? Where is she?" The words seemed to freeze David in place. His shoulders stiffened, his breath faltered, and for a long moment he could not lift his head. Clara shifted against him, her tear-streaked face turning upward with a question of her own, soft and trembling. "Yeah, Daddy. Where's Mommy? Did you find her yet?" David closed his eyes, as if bracing against a blow, his hollow expression twisting with anguish. When he finally spoke, the words came broken and heavy. "She's gone." Clara blinked, confusion flickering in her features. "Gone where?" she whispered, searching his face for an answer that would make sense. The silence stretched painfully until at last he forced the truth out, his voice cracking. "Your mama, Serena, she died last year." The world seemed to collapse around Clara. Her small hands went limp against his shirt, her lips parted, but no words came. For an instant she looked almost blank, as if her young mind could not accept the meaning. Then her face crumpled, and the sob tore out of her. "No, you said she went for a walk. You said she was coming back." David's body shook as he pressed his forehead against hers, his tears spilling freely. "I couldn't tell you, baby. You were too little. I thought I was protecting you." Her cry cut sharper this time, piercing even the hardened ears of men who had heard confessions and screams in interrogation rooms for years. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say she wasn't coming back?" David's voice cracked wide open, every word trembling under its weight. "Because I didn't want to break you. You're all I've got, Clara. I thought if you believed she might come back, maybe it would hurt less." Clara wept into his chest, her small shoulders rising and falling with the force of grief. But still she clung to him, holding as though the truth might steal him away too. Around them, the station had gone utterly silent. Hardened officers looked on with eyes burning, confronted not with a criminal, but with the raw truth of a father's misguided love, a child's shattered innocence, and a family broken by hunger and loss. Naomi blinked hard against the sting behind her eyes. This wasn't a case anymore. This was a wound split open in the middle of the station, and for the first time, every person there understood the depth of what they were witnessing. The silence after David's confession hung so heavily that it seemed to press into every corner of the station. Clara wept into her father's chest, her sobs muffled by the thin fabric of his shirt, and though the cuffs still dug into his wrists, David bent forward to hold her as best he could. His body trembled, not with resistance, but with weakness, as if grief itself was the only thing keeping him upright. Officers who only minutes before had seen him as a suspect now shifted uneasily, their earlier assumptions crumbling under the truth spilling out before them. Naomi Cole steadied herself and asked the question that hovered in every mind. "David, is it true what she said? That you don't eat?" His eyes flicked toward her, glassy and wet, before returning to the little girl in his arms. His answer came in a whisper that carried both shame and pride. "She's all I've got. If there's only enough for one of us, she eats. I'll go without. That's the way it's been for months." The words cut deeper than any denial could have. They weren't excuses, they were confessions of sacrifice made in silence, hidden even from his daughter. Clara lifted her face just enough to look at him, confusion mixing with heartbreak. "But why, Daddy? Why didn't you eat too?" He swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he replied, "Because you're growing, Clara. You needed it more. I can take the hunger. I can't take watching you starve." The explanation twisted through the air, leaving no room for judgment, only the piercing clarity of love carried to its most painful extreme. Sergeant Reed, who had kept his composure longer than most, felt his jaw tighten as he turned slightly away. He had cuffed men for violence, for cruelty, for selfishness. But what he saw now was none of those things. What he saw was a father breaking himself piece by piece to hold his daughter's world together, even as it collapsed around him. Reed's voice, usually hard, came quieter this time. "And you never asked for help?" David shook his head, his hollow frame sagging with exhaustion. "How do you ask when everyone's already forgotten you? People walk past. No one sees. And if they did, I didn't want Clara to know how far we'd fallen." His words settled over the room like stones dropping into still water, rippling through the men and women who realized they had driven by that same house countless times without ever asking what was happening inside. Naomi's chest tightened as she looked at Clara, a child who had carried hunger and unanswered questions for far too long. Clara's desperate plea for her father's arrest was no longer a mystery. It was the action of a little girl who believed that prison, with its guaranteed meals, was the only way to keep her father alive. The innocence and the desperation of that act hit Naomi with full force, and she felt tears blur her vision. For the first time since this began, she wasn't looking at a case file or a suspect. She was looking at two lives on the edge of breaking completely. The station had never felt so heavy. The clatter of keyboards and shuffle of papers that usually filled the background had gone silent, replaced only by the sound of Clara's uneven breathing as she pressed against her father's chest. David's frail body sagged beneath her weight, but the way his cuffed hands strained behind his back made it clear that if he had the strength, he would have wrapped her in the kind of embrace that no steel could contain. Naomi Cole wiped discreetly at the corner of her eye before crouching closer. She spoke gently, as though her words might fracture the fragile stillness. "Clara, sweetheart, are you hungry right now?" The child hesitated, her eyes darting to her father, searching for permission. David gave her a weak nod, his voice a husk. "Go on, baby. It's okay." Only then did she give the smallest of nods. Naomi rose quickly, signaling to an officer near the back, who disappeared down the hall and returned moments later with a plate of sandwiches. The food was set gently on the desk, but Clara didn't move toward it until Naomi guided her forward. She climbed onto a chair, her small legs swinging nervously, and reached for the bread with cautious fingers. Only when her father murmured, "It's all right," did she take a bite. The station watched in silence as the little girl chewed slowly, her expression torn between relief and guilt. David's hollow eyes followed every movement of her mouth, and his throat worked as if swallowing a meal that wasn't his. For the first time, Naomi saw hunger and love tangled together so tightly that they were indistinguishable. Sergeant Reed cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice carried its usual firmness, but underneath was something softer. Something unfamiliar to those who had worked with him for years. "We can't let them walk back out to that house with nothing." His words hung in the air, and several officers nodded silently in agreement. One spoke up, his tone uneasy. "That house isn't livable. He doesn't have work. What happens next?" Reed looked down at David Morales, thin, exhausted, and still kneeling on the floor beside his daughter. He took a long breath, then made a decision that surprised even him. "We need a janitor here at the station," he said firmly. "Morales, the job's yours if you want it." David's head snapped up, his weary eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" His voice cracked, too broken to mask his shock. Reed held his gaze steadily. "You need steady work. We need someone we can trust. It's that simple." David's lips parted, but no words came. His cuffed hands twitched behind him, his mind struggling to process what had just been offered. Then Clara slid off her chair, crumbs still clinging to her lips, and rushed to his side. Her small voice, bright for the first time that day, whispered, "Daddy, you can eat now. You'll have food too." David's chest heaved, his face crumpling under the weight of a gratitude too large for words. For the first time in months, a fragile smile flickered across his face. By the next morning, word of what had happened at Riverside Heights Police Department had already spread. A little girl had walked into the station begging them to arrest her father, not because he was cruel, but because she thought it was the only way to keep him alive. The story cut through gossip and routine like fire through dry grass, reaching every corner of the town. For months, the Morales family had been invisible, just another struggling household at the edge of Briarwood Street, where paint peeled and porches sagged. People passed by their crumbling house without stopping, too caught up in their own lives to see the signs of hunger and grief inside. Now the truth was out, and indifference was no longer an option. That afternoon, neighbors began arriving one by one at the station, and then, at the Morales home, arms full of what they could carry. A woman who ran the diner down the street stepped forward, setting a heavy bag of groceries on the porch with a determined smile. "They'll never go hungry again. Not while I'm here," she promised. Behind her, a roofer adjusted his cap and offered his services without hesitation. "That house is barely standing. I'll fix it up myself." Soon the front yard filled with people carrying casseroles, warm clothes, children's toys, and even stacks of books. For the first time in months, Clara's eyes lit up as she clutched a stuffed rabbit handed to her by a kind stranger. David stood in the doorway, Clara pressed close to his side, his expression a mix of disbelief and quiet awe. The man who had once felt forgotten now saw an entire town rallying around him. At the station, Sergeant Reed and Officer Naomi Cole watched the stream of volunteers with a quiet sense of satisfaction. What had begun as suspicion and nearly ended in tragedy had become something else entirely, a reminder that no one survives alone, and that sometimes a community must be jolted awake by the voice of a child. Reed clapped a firm hand on David's shoulder later that evening. "You start Monday," he said. "You won't have to carry this alone anymore." David's lips trembled as he tried to respond, but only 2 words managed to escape. "Thank you." His voice was rough, but his eyes, wet with emotion, said more than any speech ever could. Clara tugged on his sleeve, her smile wide for the first time in a long while. "Daddy, look, we have food now." And in that moment, David let out a breath that had been trapped in his chest for months. For the first time since Serena's death, he allowed himself to smile. What unfolded in Riverside Heights did more than save one family. It stirred an entire community awake. The case had begun with suspicion and nearly ended in tragedy, but instead it revealed how far love will go when pushed to its limits, and how blindness to another's suffering can leave scars deeper than hunger itself. Inside the station, officers who had once been quick to assume the worst found themselves quieter, changed by what they had witnessed. Reed admitted, with a gravity that surprised his colleagues, that it was a child's courage, not the system, that had restored a father's dignity. Naomi, too, carried the weight of the moment, realizing that sometimes the bravest voices are the smallest ones, and that true protection doesn't always come from handcuffs or patrol cars, but from compassion. Clara and David would go on with fuller bellies and steadier ground beneath them, but the lesson their story left behind was not theirs alone to carry. It belonged to everyone who heard it, everyone who passed by a weary neighbor without asking, everyone who convinced themselves it wasn't their place to notice. Clara's voice shook an entire town awake. But how many more children are out there hoping someone will listen before it's too late? What would our world look like if we all paid just a little more attention? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe and stay with us for more powerful stories that remind us why compassion still matters. Thank you for watching.